Welcome to the first episode of the Future Ventures series. I am your host, Pedro Uría-Recio, ex-group head of data at Axiata, a regional telecom and digital conglomerate, ex-McKinsey, and also venture partner in FutureLabs Ventures. In this first episode, we have invited a veteran of Southeast Asia's innovation and entrepreneurial scene, Kit Wong. Kit Wong is a serial entrepreneur and a seasoned executive who built and scaled up unicorn ventures such as OVO in Indonesia or LU Global here in Singapore, and also led the fast growth of notable global tech players in the region, such as, for example, Google. Kit Wong brings a unique set of capabilities, from deep product expertise to strategy and scale-up experiences. He also has deep knowledge of fintech, financial services, the asset management sector, and the innovation landscape in Asia. Additionally, Kit Wong has recently been appointed as CEO for Singapore and MD for Asia at eToro, the world's leading social trading platform. Well, Kit Wong, thank you so much for coming here. It is such a pleasure to finally get to meet you personally after having been discussing over the last few months about different topics. So, such an enormous pleasure to be here with you. I wanted to start this conversation today about venture building with a recap of your career until now, what you have been doing, how did you arrive to the place where you are, right? You have been in McKinsey, you have been in ANC, you have been in Google, you have been in OVO, so many places. So could you just let us know a little bit more your journey?
Yeah, sure. I'll probably start post-MBA. I think that's the easiest. So I did a Wharton MBA and then joined McKinsey.
Did you join in the US or?
Well, the original thought for me was to stay in the US, but then the discussion around it was McKinsey, and shall we say, encouraged me to move to Malaysia.
Okay.
And mainly because at that point in time they were growing the office and they wanted more Malaysians there. So that's where I started. I was in financial services. Actually, I was 100% financial services in the McKinsey career, right? And then did that for quite some time. I think the key takeaway for me, if I want to sum it up, I mean, the biggest takeaway for me was problem solving and structuring. You know, how do you take a big problem? How do you break it down? How do you communicate to people so they know exactly what they're doing? I mean, that to me was the biggest takeaway that I use, right? Among all the other things that you learn from McKinsey. Then from McKinsey, I went to ANZ Bank. I was looking after corporate strategy M&A for Asia. That one to me was the first large corporate job. So a lot of that was around stakeholder management, syndication. How do you then make sure you talk and get enough views, and how do you bring people together, right? So that's that sort of skill set I picked up there. It was at that time I took a leap and joined Google from banking to tech, and that was I would say probably one of the more interesting moves. Because banking is quite top down. Google's very all over the place, right? So then that was pretty much my introduction to a lot of tech. And
was it a shock at some point?
Yeah, it was. I think it took me 6 months to figure out what was going on, and I still didn't get it. But that was a good experience.
And what did you do in Google?
Strategy and business operations.
Okay.
I was in the ads business.
Okay.
And coming out of that, I think for me the most interesting bit, if I look at it, was the way the founders, Larry and Sergey, the way they set targets, the way they set a vision, and how they're constantly thinking of the next new thing, the big thing, right? And it's quite interesting within a Google environment, if you set the right vision and you have the right people there, who are all smart, young, hungry, and so forth, they will drive to the vision, So a lot of that is around pointing a direction and then helping people, clearing the way so that people then can get moving on to results.
So it's about getting kind of a distributed environment where innovation can thrive.
Correct.
Right.
So I did that for a while. I was looking to do something different, and an opportunity came up in Indonesia. And it was quite interesting because, coming after a number of years at Google, you can go anywhere, or you can go to any other company. But there was an opportunity in Indonesia to build a digital bank. And this was what, 2013, So it was quite an interesting opportunity. So that started off as a digital bank, but in the end morphed into OVO, and I can talk about that a bit later. And that was quite fun. And then from OVO, I went to Lufax, where I helped set up the Singapore office, and we built a regional wealth management platform out of Singapore. And then more recently, as you said, I'm at eToro. Again, helping them on the wealth management platform for Asia.
Well, everybody knows about eToro, which is the most, the
trading.
largest social trading platform in the world, right? But tell us more about Lufax, because maybe some people don't know about that.
Yeah. So Lufax is a member of the Ping An Group. Lufax started out in China as probably the largest P2P player in China. Now it's morphed, right? Because P2P in China is not there anymore. So now Lufax is a pretty large personal loans and wealth manager platform. Right, so it's massive, right? It got listed recently. It's a massive enterprise in China. In Singapore, in Asia, it's different. We're focusing purely on wealth management, and in this case, it's around democratizing finance, but at a certain higher level, right? So we were specifically looking at illiquid products like private equity, not so much VC, but private equity, private debt, and bringing it together using the platform as an aggregation device. In order to hit those sort of minimum subscription bulk sizes, but then we would then fractionalize it. So we were offering private equity over a mobile device for minimum 5K investments. Still 7-year lockups.
$5,000 or
$5,000.
$5,000.
Yeah. And we found that was very interesting, because what we found was when you make it that sort of number, people are interested. There's always a lot of demand for this, but if you say 300,000 minimum, then there's only a certain segment you can go for. Whereas if you make it available, and the other discussion is it's part of a balanced portfolio, is actually a very viable option. So the whole discussion around, is private equity too risky for people? For me, it comes back down to a portfolio discussion. If you have 100,000 to invest and you put 5,000 into private equity, that's not a huge exposure.
That's not a huge exposure.
On the other hand, if you have $300,000 and you put the whole lot into one private equity deal, that's a bit risky, right? So it's about balanced portfolio.
Perfect, very good. Well, so thank you very much for this introduction. We're going to discuss more focusing around venture building, right? So we're going to discuss about how to identify opportunities, how to grow these opportunities, how to manage people in a corporate venture, how to manage the governance between the motherhood of the corporate parent of the venture and the different ventures in the portfolio. But maybe we can start with your experience in OVO, because that was precisely a corporate venture building experience, right? Can you tell us a little bit about what is the idea behind OVO and where it was, where that idea was when you joined?
Okay. So the OVO was founded by the Lippo Group,
by
Lippo itself, and basically...
And Lippo Group is an Indonesian conglomerate.
Yes. So they were at the ideation stage in order to look at different businesses that they could venture into. And one of the ideas that came up was a digital bank. And that was basically at that point in time where they had looked at the landscape and said, this could be interesting for us. They have a banking license and a few of the ingredients were there. So that was at that stage then, and then I was approached to see whether I'd be interested to help them kick it off. That's basically how it started. So when I came in, there was no employees. I think I was employee number 1.
You were employee number 1?
Yeah,
wow.
I think so. Maybe there were a couple here and there, but definitely about employee number 1. And I was at that time I was brought in. I was a CEO for that setup, and we started building and designing a digital bank. Right, so the full works, right? Core bank system, all that, working under an existing license, right? So it would become a sub-brand maybe of an existing bank offshoot,
Okay.
So that was the whole concept behind it. And this is where it's interesting was we started that way, and we realized after a period of time that actually the digital bank in itself was not sufficient. Because it sounds nice, but what really do consumers want with a digital bank, and where's the differentiation versus a traditional bank? And on top of that, there was another enterprise in Indonesia at the time called Genius. So Genius had started building about a year and a half earlier than OVO, and it was getting to the stage. We had caught up quite well, but they were still going to beat us to the punch. And so then the discussion was at that point, should we still go ahead with the digital bank positioning or try something different? Right? And that's where then we morphed it into OVO. We already had settled on the brand name.
So today OVO is a payments
and membership.
A membership platform rather than a digital bank.
Correct. But the background and the whole rails is built like a digital bank.
Okay.
right? But we just didn't see the value in going to market with digital bank number 2. And that was where we pivoted, expanded the company, where then Lipo brought in a few other sub-companies they had and brought it all together. And that's when my job morphed to Chief Product Officer.
Okay.
And then that's when we then focused on, so we were already having the rails for banking and payments and so forth. They brought in one of the smaller companies which had a membership services, and we brought it all together and went to market with both payments and memberships.
Okay.
Rewards is a better word.
Okay, perfect. And had you done venture building at that time
No.
when you arrived to Ovo? Because you were in Google, and that was, you were
Google,
just saying that
you
you
build
got in,
business, but it's not the same.
it's not the same. So what was your mindset about how corporate venture building should be done when you arrived to Ovo, and how did you adapt that mindset? How did the way of building ventures that you had in your mind evolve over time?
I would argue, I've not done it before at that time, right? So you can argue you're a bit naive. It's kind of like, oh, that's a cool idea, let's just go do something, and given my background in banking and Google, and somebody gives you an opportunity to say, hey, you want to build a digital bank at that point in time, and this is, again, like I said, in 2013, right, where nobody's really talking about it was pretty cool.
Okay.
So that was the general thing. Was more around, okay, let's do something entrepreneurial. There's an opportunity here, and then there are certain ingredients that make sense versus doing it yourself, right? And so that's the bit. So I didn't really have many preconceived notions. I have a better idea now, clearly. It's one of those things that, okay, I'll just approach it like a startup and just build from scratch and see what happens.
Okay. And what is that better idea that you have now? So if you can look past in time, what are the key lessons learned or the key ingredients that corporates should take into account when it comes to building ventures?
Let's skip aside the whole point on what is the business idea, because that's part of that discussion. I think the key thoughts for me for a corporate is, what are you bringing to the picture? Other than money, or maybe a bit of talent, what do you bring into this wider picture? Because if you're not bringing anything, then the question is, what's the value of that, right? So I think that's one set of questions around that. Second set of questions would be very clearly set up the governance right. And make sure that if you really want to do a venture build, what is the venture build style that you want to do? Is it a separate, totally independent run, or is it actually a division within your corporation? When and you can define it any way you want. But I think agree on that upfront, and that model then defines how you work with the team that builds the venture in itself. Those to me would be fairly big issues to solve. Other than, of course, what's the business idea, and does it make money and all that stuff.
Let's get into these items one by one, right? Let's discuss a little bit about the corporate assets. What are the assets that the corporate is bringing to the table? Then we'll go into the other things that you have said. So in the case of Lipo and the payments platform and the corporate bank, the digital bank, what were the assets, or what were the different ways in which Lipo was adding value to the venture? And in general, if we can expand that more generally, what are typically the assets that a corporate can bring to the table to a venture?
So again, setting aside the whole point on money and seed and all that, right? Lipo is a big conglomerate, and quite a successful conglomerate. And they have businesses, a wide range of businesses. I think what made a lot of sense for what Ovo was doing is that they're actually very strong in consumer-related businesses. So they have a coffee chain, they have malls, they run supermarket chains, they run department stores, they run hospitals. So a lot of their focus is on people and people-related or consumer-related businesses. Right? So those were assets which, when we had overlooked at it, and this is in the discussion on do we stay a digital bank or do we morph, was, okay, you know what, there's a range of assets. How can we then leverage those assets to make this bigger? And clearly, if you look at it, was rewards programs. At that point in time, everybody kind of had their own reward program. So the concept was to bring it all together into one generic reward program and and use that scale to roll it out for customer adoption. So that was clearly one sort of assets they had access to. But life is never as easy as that, right? You don't just say, I want it, and everybody gives it to you. You still have to build a demonstrable value proposition. You still need to go around to each one and say, what are you doing differently? Even with corporate blessing, it's still a series of negotiated deals throughout, right? But it's a lot easier because you're under the same umbrella, and at least the vision and the direction is clear.
And apart from introductions to different channel partners or other members of the corporate family, what other kinds of assets do corporates typically provide to ventures? Or
Well, connections.
connections?
Right? If a large corporate, you probably have all sorts of partners everywhere, right? Clearly within the professional services, you probably know everybody that's there, and a lot of times, let's take professional services, law firms. For a venture, you just grab whoever you can grab and just go, whoever's willing to maybe work for you in the first place or even service you, right? Whereas, with a large corporate venture, large corporate backing, it's useful that they can help identify what is the right professional service to help you for your particular problem, right? I think, the days of somebody being a generic problem solver is getting harder and harder. And you will find that especially in our case, say we're doing a rewards program, I need to write a generic set of rewards T's and C's, and I can just get one off the shelf. But in this case, because we're dealing very much with people data across a large number of fields, then you really need somebody who understands the PDPA rules and how that works in that sort of environment. So then the ability to identify the right specialist at the right point in time was also extremely useful.
So basically, by providing all these assets to the ventures, can we say that corporate ventures could be in a way faster, they could scale up faster than garage based on the typical ventures that we have in a garage? Is that the advantage that the corporate partner can be?
It's a mix.
Faster, or can they go faster? Can they grow bigger? What is the final result of having these assets?
You can't discount the business idea in its own, right? Because even with all the ingredients, it still comes back to the business idea behind it. But I would say with the right ingredients in place from a corporate venture, you can kick it off faster and you can move a bit faster. Again, assuming the right governance in place and so forth, right? Because you can go the other way around and the corporate venture ends up strangling the startup. But generally, it would smooth the way, especially given that the sort of people that you want to hire are people who are hungry, who are just going to push ahead, but may not actually have the depth of experience that you need to be able to advise properly or make the right decision. So having that balancing act is useful.
So let's move into this point, which is the second thing you mentioned before, governance, right? What are the different kinds of governance frameworks that you have seen working in corporate venture building? So what are the key successful ways of doing it?
I think it's hard to give a standard answer for that. A lot depends on the culture of the mothership and how the mothership operates. And that then also determines the culture of the venture to some extent, right? And for example, is it a case where the venture is set up as 100% independent? Effectively, the mothership does is provide seed capital, it sits on the board, and maybe that's it, and then this thing goes off on its own, in which case then it's quite a clear separation. Or is there a closer mix? Like in the case of OVO, there's a closer mix between the parent company, the direction of OVO, and how it also interacts with the other divisions, right? In which case then you can't be too separated from. So those are bits where there is an overall question on the culture of the organization, how that wants to work. Because in some cultures, having a pure independent split just doesn't work in that culture. Right? That's one set. The other area is interesting for me in my experience so far on corporate. I think I see more tensions come up with the supporting services than with the businesses. So for example, if I'm doing something and another business is doing something within the corporate environment, usually we can figure out if there's a way to work together. But I tend to see more tension that comes up with the finance, the HR, the operations, and all that, because in a corporate, these guys are the ones keeping the rails running. These are the ones keeping it, saying, okay, you need to behave this way, this way, this way, because that's the governance we put in place.
So following procurement practices that might delay the natural speed of the startup needs to have, right?
Those are the bits, I think, for a corporate venture. You need to be very clear when you're doing it. How do you want them to interact with those sort of rules? Because those are the rules that I find that tend to create trouble for a venture startup. Okay. Right? Because the whole point of the venture startup, you want to do it is off you go and run fast, right? On the other hand, if I have to buy my business cards from your central procurement credit business card, which happens to sit in Australia, tell me how does that make sense? But it makes sense from a corporate angle. It doesn't make sense from this angle. So I do tend to see more tensions in, at least in my experience, with those set of areas rather than the business areas. The business areas is business, right? Maybe I'm building something that is going to cannibalize somebody else. You will get into those sort of arguments, but those are the same sort of arguments you will face in any normal market anyway. It's just a question on then, what are the constraints being put on this to operate within that environment.
Okay, so I understand from what you say that the right governance, the right structure depends a lot on the corporate culture of the parent. But are there common traits? Are there best practices and things to avoid across all cultures? Can we say so? So what will be those common traits?
I mean, generally speaking, if you want to do this well and do it fast, then you need to set it up with a certain amount of independence. You need to hire the right people, and my biggest advice to corporates is you take your time to find the right person, with the right mix that you want. But once you found that person, really, truly delegate authority and let them run. If it doesn't work, move them out. I mean, that's part of life. But once you've got it, really set it up well and just say, okay, it's yours. Like a venture business would
like
do.
A proper venture.
Yeah. Now, and then of course, the idea would be for the person hired, the new CEO or whatever, that the person comes in with a mindset of saying, okay, I have the right to do this, but I'm also not an idiot. I will leverage whatever I can from the mothership that gets me to my next stage even faster. So for example, you go in there and you want to use SAP, but they have a deal with somebody else that is 30% cheaper.
So yes,
why not? Just use it. It's 30%. As long as it can set up in a way that doesn't constrain the new business.
Perfect. Understood. That point that you just mentioned about HR is interesting, right? Getting people who have the right incentives to run that unit as a startup, as a venture, not as a corporate department, right? And that might not necessarily be easy. What were the challenges or the best practices that you would recommend when it comes to hiring and when it comes to defining the incentives of those people?
Okay, I tend to like stock in general. I wasn't so much.
But stock that's something that corporates are typically not familiar with.
Yes. But I generally like it. I'd rather people be a bit hungrier and also in there for the longish term. And so therefore I'd like stock compensation. But it needs to be designed well, right? If stock compensation is designed as a bluff, then people know about it pretty quickly. So it has to be something real and tangible. I've seen enough of these where where they have stock agreements and they're like subject to this, subject to that, subject to that. Yes, I know there's a certain need, but those things don't tend to work well because people are not.
Would it be from your point of view, the recommendation, would it be like pure stock in the venture, or would it be more of an ESOP kind of
that depends.
Arrangement?
That really depends. If, for example, there's no intention of ever spinning off the venture, then giving stock in the venture is not terribly relevant, right? Either way, it doesn't have to be stock. It can be a synthetic, but something that ties in the team to rewards based on performance, right? Even at the purest level, a pure commission-only sort of structure could work, but it's pretty hard to get people in a pure commission structure.
Understood.
So that the team knows that their rewards is based on the achievements of this business and is 100% tied to that to a large extent. I think I like that a lot generally.
And how would you approach the concerns that corporates have typically when it comes to give equity away in their units? Because that's something that they typically don't do, right? Is quite uncommon, I would say. So what are the different ways of overcoming this tension?
Synthetic.
Right? Okay.
So for example, you could say, okay, there's a unit being set up, there's certain revenue targets and all that, and literally you just set up and say, okay, X% of revenue will just get distributed down as a.
So that's a way of having a synthetic equity, synthetic
correct.
stock.
As long as the plan is easy to explain and everybody kind of understands that, so that they are aligned, that's also fine.
Okay, that's perfect. Very good. There is one point that you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, which was about ideation, how to get the right idea, validating the idea. Maybe we can deep dive a little bit into this, right? So you were saying that in OVO, the initial idea was creating a digital bank, then it pivoted into payments and rewards. what are the right ways of identifying where the opportunities are and validating those opportunities? Startups typically in garage, right? They do a lot of A/B testing, contacting early clients.
Same.
So you will have to do the same thing.
Same. Whatever tools that you have, you will do. It's never a science, right? I mean, the more traditional training that you and I had is, what is the size of the revenue pool? You know,
like
is there
McKinsey
a
kind of.
Yeah. You know, that's a value in that, you know, as well.
So you can identify pockets
Yes.
of opportunity,
Yes.
but that way you will not be able to identify the actual opportunity
Correct.
inside the pocket.
Correct. You can, at least I think the top-down version, revenue pools, all that, gives you a sense of size of the prize. You know, then the actual niche will not come from that. The actual niche to me will come from really understanding who the consumer is, if it's a consumer or whatever, but who's the customer, what is the pain points that they're facing, and do you have a solution there that works? And then once you've got that, the next question is that particular solution or pain point, you know, is that worth $50 or is it worth, you know, way more than that, right? And then that in that sense becomes maybe good faith, you know. But more rapidly coming up with a series of prototypes that you can test with the customer and get rapid feedback becomes an easy way for you to get steps towards realization of it. But there's no rocket science. You know, if you spend a lot of time, you know, crunching the numbers, you know, it's a waste of time, because the numbers are the numbers. All you want is something that says, yep, roughly. The rest becomes go for it, try it, say it, you know, test it, succeed, fail, move on, refine, move on, refine. Right? So the pivots are very important, actually.
How does this approach of pivots, which is, it makes total sense, this is how startups really work in the real world, but how do corporates cope with this approach? Because they're not used to that. It's another of the things that corporates typically don't do, right? So you make a business plan, and changing the business plan in a corporate is kind of a big decision. When in a startup, is something that could happen quite often, right? So how do you close the gap between the two?
But this
worlds?
comes back to the governance structure, right? Are you setting this up as something that is somewhat independent, or is it a division off, right? And the moment it's a division off, then it falls under a lot of those sort of challenges, you know. So that becomes my first point will be that's an internal discussion that needs to happen with the corporate venture builder, and say, okay, what is it that you really want to do? And how much of the change are you willing to do? Secondly, the opportunity needs to be defined in a way that allows pivot, right? So let's say you take OVO. If I define my opportunity as 100%, I want to build a digital bank and be the first to launch a digital bank in Indonesia, then that's all I'm building.
Yep.
As opposed to the discussion is, look, we want to get more consumers together. We want to start with collecting together consumers' money and helping them with transactions. And then from that itself has opportunity to pivot, right? So in that sense, at the beginning, I would keep it reasonably broad, have a direction so everybody's aligned. So for example, at least to say, I'm going after consumer or am I going after B2B, right? At least that's a key decision. You know, but at least have something there that defines it, but allows the freedom for it to refine as it goes on.
Okay.
I think what is needed to answer the question on pivot is ability for the business to recognize when something's working or not working. And ability for then the corporate to say, okay, off you go, right? Or I can help you this way. I'll give you a specific example from OVO. One of the things that became quite successful was paying for parking. You know, so in Indonesia at the time, you go take your parking ticket, you go to a booth or whatever it is, and you pay, and then you get your parking ticket stamped, validated, and then you go in line, and then you go on your way out, you hand it in to the counter, and then they open the gate for you.
Same
right?
in Malaysia.
Yeah. So we were going for a lot of meetings, and it became a real pain in the ass to keep doing that. So, you know, as one of the things that we do, and this is where the freedom of venture comes in, say, look, what the heck? We put a bunch of people together and we just built it. So we built a methodology and we tied it to one car park that we were using a lot because of our meetings there, that allowed us to scan the ticket, pay it online through the app, and then immediately get a digital verification, which you then pass to the counter. You know, and as soon as the counter gets it and checks it, it's okay and goes off. And we did it as our own service to solve a pain point that we had, you know, but we didn't think about it as a business. And now you look at it and go, of course it's a business, right? And we just suddenly realized we're seeing adoptions go up. And we looked at it and go, oh, it's this thing. And then immediately we pivoted and said, well, shoot, boom. And immediately then the team got started and started signing up car parks around the place in order to facilitate that, right? And that hit adoption. But it's one of those things where there was a pain point that we picked up, but we didn't recognize it as a pain point en masse. But we tried it, put it in the market, so to speak, and immediately the feedback was great. And then the question is scale. So they immediately just ramp it out and sign people up. You know, but that's the sort of freedom it needs to be, right? And if you ask me, if you go back and say, hey, you're building a payments and rewards, what's car parks going to do with it? And although it's one transaction, it's still only one, but it's adoption.
A payment transaction.
But it's adoption. The key is consumer adoption, right? It's a pain point that helps you get.
So it's kind of a growth hacking tactic, right? So now you get the car parks, then you do something else to get another business, then you get another thing. And finally you are getting adoption of your payments platform across a different number of industries, right? Or a different number.
I'm pretty sure that all this food delivery, to some extent it just happened because people noticed something, you know?
Correct.
I mean, I still remember I was using Uber and I needed to get something from a shop, and this is before all that, and I was like, I'm not going to go drive. I was in Malaysia, like you, and it's from one end to KL to the other. I'm not going to go drive 1.5 hours to get there, right? So I called the guy up and said, look, I really want it. I'll pay for you now, right? I'll send the money to your account. I'll call the Uber. You just put it in the car for me.
Yeah, just put it in the Uber and then.
And the guy was like, what are you doing? And I was like, just try.
And that was in what year, more or less?
This is way back. This is probably 2014, 2015.
2014.
That's
it. That was
and
early.
it didn't exist, right? And the guy said, look, do me a favor, take a picture of the guy's license plate, take a picture of putting it in the car, and I just trust it's going to happen, right? And we tried it, and I got it, and I was like, you know what, this works. And so that was happenstance. Now, I didn't go launch delivery, and I was stupid. I was like, I didn't see that value. But clearly, people were hacking around doing that anyway. And so the key point on that will be, when you got that service, go listen to your consumer. They're already figuring out ways of using it beyond what you already know. The question becomes, then you're in a position to take that and turn it into a service en masse.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, many of the ideas, the great ideas in venture building come from problems that the founders themselves experience, right? So those are probably the best ideas. Very good. So just to finalize, I wanted to ask you about what you think the outlook of corporate venture building is going to be in the region going forward over the next few years.
On the hand that, I think the opportunities clearly exist because we have a lot of problems that still haven't been solved, right? And it's just a matter of putting the right resources together for it. So I do think that the scope for venture building is still pretty big. And there are certain advantages, right? Where if you're part of a venture, and I said, if you're part of a already existing ecosystem, I don't have to go build an ecosystem. I just have to build something that I can plug into your ecosystem. Immediately, I'm a stake up, right? I mean, if you look at the success of a lot of the ventures tied to the Alis and the Tencents, a lot of it reflect that. Right? So I do think there's an opportunity within that. And it also makes sense for a large corporate, the old school discussion, am I going to be vertically integrated or horizontally or whatever it is? But right now the discussion is, I don't have to be either. I'll just start a bunch of ventures that are either vertical or horizontal. I just need to manage that together in such a way that it's cohesive. So I do think that sort of opportunity is great. On the other hand, the flip side for it would be, I think the talent opportunity is a problem, right?
The talent.
There's less and less talent floating around that can do this. It's not the easiest thing to do.
So there is less and less talent because they are going into other opportunities.
There's a lot of demand for this talent. Right? There's a lot of demand for fintech people in Singapore right now. And that becomes then your talent pool.
So you mean that maybe a lot of talent prefer to go into a Series B startup, a Series B fintech startup, or be a founder rather than being a corporate? That.
Some of the ingredients you need for somebody who's a successful venture building team are very, very similar to someone who's going to be successful as an entrepreneur or a startup in his own right.
Yeah, because they are entrepreneurs.
Correct. That talent pool is extremely limited. And then that talent pool, people don't understand that yet, but that talent pool now, today, has a lot of choice, right? And so the question becomes, how do you bring that talent pool in? And that's the value proposition that needs to be crafted. Right? If you go to that talent and say, hey, come join me, here's all my corporate stuff, chances are you won't. On the other hand, if you say, look, you come, you have this freedom, you can do this.
And you have equity incentives.
I have all this set up in a way that gets you from A to B, 30% faster than you would somewhere else.
Correct.
That's a discussion that has to happen.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for coming here today.
Sure.
And for letting us know more about corporate venture building and your experience. And also congratulations on your new job in eToro.
Yes.
And It has been great to be here with you, and let's keep in touch.
Sure. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.